Judgment, as in judging other people primarily, is a common characteristic of the human psyche. We judge ourselves, we judge other people, we judge circumstances, we judge events. You name it, we judge it. And this thing called judging is so common and so prevalent that it gets easily overlooked as what is really a critical component of the ego and of how the ego operates in relation to other egos. And this is significant because most of life consists of interactions between human egos. Judging and the way we judge is also important to examine because it has several layers. When you look deeper into it, you discover that the actual judging, the criticism, the blame, the accusation, the disapproval and the condemnation, and of course the vocalizing of all these to other people in the form of gossip, all of this is, it turns out, is only the surface of what is really going on inside the psychological machinery of the ego. For example, when you peel away, let's say, the top layer of disapproval or criticism or blame, you'll find a particular kind of resistance. And you'll begin to see that the judgment, all judgment, stems from resistance and is a result of resistance. The word resist means to stand back. And this is what the ego does when it confronts or when it's confronted by something or someone that does not or who does not meet its expectations. And these expectations of our ego are always false, self-imposed expectations. The first thing that happens, and this is what is so barely perceptible, but the first thing that happens when something happens that it doesn't meet our expectations, the first sort of psychological twitch that happens in the ego is this stepping back internally in what you can experience as a wordless form of no, followed by a feeling of dislike. So there's this stepping back internally of no and of disliking in some manner what we're seeing. And from there, very quickly, the ego concludes that the problem is in the other person or in the situation. Never does it occur to us that the source of the problem, the real problem, lies within us, namely in the notion that we have of ourselves as a person. If you can get this far in the examination of judgment, if you can peel off that top layer and start to look underneath it and see what lies behind it, you'll see that this mechanism of judgment and the ego that it pulsates from, they have two specific consequences, or there are two specific consequences, you could say, in terms of awareness, and particularly in terms of how judging and how this resistance, how together they block awareness and deflect awareness and derail awareness. Consider, for instance, what might happen if there was no ego and therefore no judgment interfering with just clear awareness. On the one hand, awareness would perceive and enter into the truth of what it is perceiving. It would actually pierce the truth of what it perceives. It would enter into it in that sense. And it would just see perfectly clearly what was in front of it. It would just see what is as it is. At the same time, the reality of what it perceives would actually enter into awareness. It would come back into awareness. And as a result, there would be a deep knowing to accompany the very clear seeing. Awareness would see, and it would just see what is actually in front of it. There wouldn't be judgment. There wouldn't be any kind of barrier or block from the ego and from judging. And what would reflect back to awareness from that perception would be a deep knowing about what it was perceiving. And both this clear seeing and this deep knowing would have a transformational effect on awareness itself. The seeing and the knowing would, in effect, feed conscious awareness. But ordinarily for most humans, this doesn't happen because the ego gets in the way. It literally stands between the pure perception of awareness and whatever awareness is perceiving, be it something in ourselves or in another person or in the world. And this middleman, this what we call the ego, this imaginary sense of self, this notion of being a unique person, this is what turns out to be the real issue and the real source of the problem. The source of the problem is never another person or a situation. But even when you see this, it's not enough just to decide to stop being judgmental or to work on your judgment so as to be a better person, or because the Bible says it's bad to judge. None of that's enough, because all of that is just the ego working on itself, trying to fix itself, trying to better itself, trying to appear better in the eyes of others. The only thing that can really work, and certainly if it's to have a lasting, permanent result, is for awareness to see all this, to see the judgment, to see all the forms that judgment takes, and to see how all of them are really promulgations of the ego and defense mechanisms of the sense of self as I and me and mine. And in seeing this, to transcend the ego in a way that uproots it and gradually dissolves it. There is, however, another stumbling block that can happen, where when you see judgment in yourself more clearly, this seeing will reflect back into the mind, and there'll be a reaction whereby the ego then judges itself. We're judging ourselves for being judgmental, and we end up criticizing ourselves and condemning ourselves now for having condemned others. We judge ourselves for judging. This is an automatic reflex of the ego. And it's just another example, really, of how it sabotages itself by turning against itself. This happens in many forms in the human psyche. But judgment is a very common way where we not only judge others, then we judge ourselves, and then we judge ourselves for judging others and judging ourselves. And when this happens, this just becomes a psychological loop, and it just perpetuates the feeling of I, the feeling of me, and in doing so is perpetuating what is called the ego. Fortunately, awareness is always outside this loop. It can get identified with it, of course, and that will perpetuate the loop, but awareness actually exists outside the loop. It just needs to keep realizing this. And it has to keep realizing at simpler and simpler and deeper levels of itself, while recognizing that it, that is awareness, is a completely different dimension, a dimension of pure being. And in this respect, the aim isn't to eliminate judgment. The aim is simply to notice judgment in ourselves and then use this noticing of the judgment to look behind it at the sense of self that is protecting itself with the judgment, and that is using judgment as both a weapon and a justification. The aim is to see how this psychological apparatus, the ego, which lies at our core feeling of identity, to see how it operates and sustains itself, how it is really desperate to sustain itself. And in what is really a pathetic way, uses judgment of other people and situations to validate itself and justify itself. So again, the aim is not to eradicate the judgment. The aim is to look behind it. Use it as a lever to look behind it and see this feeling of self that is operating with this defense mechanism, and to see all of this as clearly as possible, with the ultimate aim of transcending it as awareness.